Begin by cutting the cable crimp off the end of the dropper cable. Use a 2mm hex wrench to release the cable pinch bolt. Remove the cable from the dropper lever. Use a 4mm hex wrench to loosen the seat post clamp and lift and remove the dropper seat post. The dropper cable will come with it, but the cable housing will stay behind. Remove the battery cover and then use your key to unlock the battery and remove it. Remove the drive side crank bolt with an 8mm hex wrench, turning it counterclockwise. Thread in the crank puller to the crank arm. Thread in the crank puller until it stops. Begin to turn the inner stud by turning the outer handle clockwise to press the crank off of the spindle. Next, release the tension on the derailleur to remove the chain. Use the Park Tool LRT-2 on the chainring's center lock ring. Hold the chainring in place and rotate the lock ring clockwise to loosen. The lock ring is reverse threaded. Once the lock ring is off, the chainring can be removed. Move to the non-drive side and remove the non-drive side crank bolt by turning it clockwise with an 8mm hex key. The non-drive side crank bolt is reverse threaded. To remove the crank arm, repeat the same crank removal steps used for the drive side. Use a Torx T10 wrench to remove the 2 bolts on the motor side cover. Remove the side cover. Use a 2.5mm hex wrench to remove the 4 bolts of the lower motor cover, then remove the lower cover. Use a Torx T40 wrench to remove the 6 bolts that mount the motor to the frame. Carefully lift the motor from the frame to access the cable connections. Disconnect the main terminal plug by pinching the buckle to release the plug. Then, disconnect the remaining 3 round plugs by gripping the cable and pulling straight down. Use a 3mm hex wrench to remove the 2 bolts that hold the terminal, as well as support the battery cover. Move the terminal inward and out through the open area where the motor was located. Use a 3mm hex wrench to remove the 2 bolts on the lock assembly and then remove the assembly. Use a 2.5mm hex wrench to remove the 2 bolts of the cable cover in the battery compartment. Remove the cable cover. Remove the stem of the bike using a 5mm hex wrench to remove the top cap bolt and then a 4mm hex wrench to loosen both of the stem clamp bolts. Unplug the display connection from the wire harness. Lift off the stem and handlebar and headset spacers, then guide the fork out of the bottom of the head tube. Remove the plastic end on the cable housing. Remove the cable spacer from the upper headset dust cap. And then remove the dropper cable housing from the head tube of the frame out of the seat tube. Remove the insulating foam from the old housing and slide it onto the new piece of cable housing. Ensure the new housing is the same length as the previous piece. Feed the new cable housing through the battery compartment and out of the head tube. Guide it through the cable spacer and out of the headset dust cap. Run the other end of the cable housing through the bottom of the battery compartment and up, exiting out of the top of the seat tube. Ensure the foam insulator is positioned at the bend where the cable goes into the seat tube. Replace the cable spacer and the dust cap onto the headset while simultaneously reinstalling the fork steer tube from the bottom up. Replace the headset spacers, followed by the stem and handlebar assembly. Reinstall the top cap and spacer assembly. Using a 5mm hex wrench, snug the preload bolt and align the handlebar straight with the front wheel. Alternate tightening the two stem clamp bolts with a 4mm hex wrench until both are torqued to 8 to 10 Newton meters. Reconnect the display to the display harness by aligning the arrows and firmly pressing the connections together. Arrange the cables through the down tube into the open motor compartment of the frame. Replace the cable cover in the battery compartment and reinstall the two bolts using a 2.5mm hex wrench. Guide the battery terminal back through the motor opening and into its proper mounting position. Reinstall the battery terminal bolts and torque them to 3 to 5 Newton meters. Reinstall the battery lock assembly at the upper end of the battery compartment. Insert the key during installation to assist in the alignment of the assembly. Torque the lock assembly bolts to 3 to 5 Newton meters. Next, install the Aventon A100 mid-drive motor. Reconnect the corresponding cables. Make sure the colors correspond, the arrows align, and the plugs snap into place. Carefully guide the motor back into the opening in the frame, ensuring no cables are crushed or pinched. Reinstall the 6 motor mounting bolts with a Torx T40 wrench. Pre-thread all 6 bolts and then fully tighten each with a torque of 20 to 25 Newton meters. Install the lower motor cover. Use a 2.5mm hexagonal wrench to install the 4 bolts of the lower cover. Torque to 1.5 to 2 Newton meters. Install the side motor cover by using a Torx T10 wrench to reinstall the 2 cover bolts. Torque to 0.8 to 1 Newton meter. Next, reinstall the left crank arm. Find your non-drive side crank bolt marked with an L. The bolt is reverse threaded. Tighten by turning the bolt counterclockwise to a torque of 40 Newton meters. Reinstall the chainring lock ring using your Park Tool LRT-2. Apply a small amount of grease to the lock ring threads and thread it on by hand. The lock ring is reverse threaded. Tighten by turning the lock ring counterclockwise. Hold the chainring firmly with your left hand and do not let it rotate. Fully tighten the lock ring to a torque of 30 Newton meters. Install the chain onto the chainring. Reinstall the right crank arm with the remaining crank bolt marked with an R. Ensure to position the crank arm 180 degrees opposite the other crank arm's orientation. Reinstall the crank bolt and tighten it to a torque of 40 Newton meters. Test to ensure the drivetrain is working properly. Reinstall the battery. Insert the battery cover and lock it into place. Take your new dropper cable and feed it into the dropper cable housing, entering from the seat post side, and pull the excess up from the top. This is also a good time to add some grease to the seat tube of your bike. Take your dropper post and insert the cable bushing end into the lever mechanism on the bottom of the dropper post. Guide the dropper cable and housing to mate with the bottom of the dropper post. You can pull up on the excess cable at the top end to ensure the housing fully seats into the dropper post. Once it is seated, pull up on the cable as you push down on the dropper post, allowing the housing to be displaced toward the front of the bike. Insert the dropper cable into the end of the dropper lever and seat the dropper cable housing into the barrel adjuster. Insert the dropper cable into the thumb lever, pull any slack tight, and secure the cable with the pinch bolt using a 2mm hex wrench. Position the seat straight and at the preferred max height. Tighten the seat post clamp using a 4mm hex wrench and torque to 5 to 7 Newton meters. Test the function of the dropper post a few times. Use the barrel adjuster on the dropper lever if you need to add or reduce cable tension. Trim the excess dropper cable at the end of the lever to about 30 millimeters of length. Cap the end by installing a cable crimp.